So our next speaker is going to be Margo Shea from the History Department at Salem State University. There she focuses on public history, urban studies, and oral history, as well as local and community history and heritage. Her interest in the ways in which we interact with history and memory in public life has influenced her most recent work, Derry City, Memory and Public Struggle in Northern Ireland, which we have available for purchase here today, I do believe. Today, her talk is going to be titled Bulldozers and Army Tanks, Remembering Twinned Violence in the Bogside in the Wake of Bloody Sunday. And after her talk, we're going to have a Q&A for all of our speakers, and then we're going to have that very promised coffee break. So, Margo, come on up.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay? Is that better? Okay, or is that too much now? Always searching for the happy medium. As an historian, I've steered clear of Bloody Sunday and the Troubles, partly because I think it refutes an academic gaze, but mostly because I'm sensitive to the fact that I am always an outsider to Derry. And as such, I'm inherently blind and deaf, or simply not privy to information that I think one needs in order to do justice to the history. I also believe that certain stories are not ours to tell. And for me, the story of Bloody Sunday is one of those. At the same time, I've been living with Derry for over 20 years in one way or another, and I wanted to be part of this commemoration and this conversation. So today, I'm going to share some thoughts about something that's not often talked about, the intersections between urban redevelopment and the Troubles in Derry. Using a collection of oral histories that the Inner City Trust put together in the early to mid-1980s, I want to suggest that the period before the redevelopment looms large and is really seen through the lens of the conflict, including Bloody Sunday, and the ways that it disrupted the city's physical coordinates and its social geographies. Americans often assume that people don't come from where they live, right? So when we're getting acquainted, we often ask people, where are you from? Living in Derry and returning to do research there in the late 90s and 2010s, I sometimes ask Derry people this question. And if they were over the age of 50 or 60, they would often say, well, I'm from, and then they would name streets. Wellington Street, Friels Terrace, Naylor's Row, Walker's Place. And these street names were familiar to me because of the research that I was doing, but they didn't exist anymore. They had been bulldozed in the 1960s and the early 1970s. So I was really curious about this continued sense of identification with a historic and largely remembered geography of Old Derry. As an example, here's just a little clip of John Hume. John Hume spent probably like 1971 driving journalists around Derry. I'm sure Rob's get into that at some point. But he's driving a journalist around the Bogside, and he stops at the Lecky Road to point out where his people come from.
We're now going along to the heart of the Bogside itself. And this area is known as Free Derry Corner, and this is Free Derry Row. And this is where my own people come from. My grandparents lived in that house there.
That's burnt, it's due for demolition.
Yeah, and my mother was born there and grew up there, and my aunts still live in this row. So the Bogside is more...
He goes on to say the Bogside is in my blood. So when the civil disturbances broke out in Derry in the late 60s, the area was not only in a state of political flux. By 1969, the Bogside was a perpetual construction and demolition site. Dilapidated, boarded-up housing sat alongside the new high-rise flats and tidy maisonettes built during the first round of urban redevelopment. Protests took place in the midst of that process, you always wonder, like, why are there so many bricks and stones around, right? It's not because they were just always there. It was because they were used for building or they were left as remnants of demolition, and they became super useful for throwing, for taking shelter behind, for building barricades. So these two processes, protest and urban redevelopment, often collided. There's just an eyewitness report from 1969. One of my favorite examples is the very, very well-known and well-remembered civil rights steward, Vinnie Coyle. He used to say, in a tongue-in-cheek reference to police reports, the police would yell, "Disperse, disperse, do not congregate here." And Vinnie Coyle would say, "Dispose, dispose, do not corrugate here." It was, so obviously, initially, many of you know this history, Derry's nationalists and Catholics cheered the bulldozers and the wrecking balls. Tearing down those damp, decrepit houses of the South Ward was like smashing the physical remnants of the political universe that they were trying to destroy. As old homes fell to the ground and plans for new housing got underway, relief outweighed regret. During the civil rights movement, advocates had framed the housing crisis as a concrete byproduct of an entire set of social, political, and economic relations. Publicly subsidized housing for Catholics and nationalists had largely been restricted to the South Ward for a really long time to maintain electoral advantage for Unionists in a city that was overwhelmingly Catholic and nationalist. So housing was this thing that had both symbolic and tangible meaning. In 1973, Eamon McCann was talking in 1973. Eamon McCann is still talking, and I think most of us really appreciate that. But he said housing was a way of launching an assault on Unionist power in the city. And most people associated the day-to-day problems that they had somehow with housing. So when the Londonderry Corporation was suspended and it was replaced under Newtown legislation with appointed commissioners to the Londonderry Development Commission by order of the Prime Minister Terence O'Neill in 1969, Catholic Derry welcomed the redevelopment, including a crash housing program. But urban redevelopment was a whole new kind of rupture. It introduced dislocations that no one really could have predicted. By 1974, the Bogside's population was halved. 15,000 residents of the area were moved to housing estates that ringed the city. So Chantal, Gallia, Ballyarnet. As the Troubles evolved from a series of civil disturbances into what the British military called a classic insurgency, and ultimately a terrorist insurgency, the redevelopment increasingly incorporated architectural and planning elements that facilitated security forces' control over movements into, out of, and within nationalist neighborhoods, both in the areas of the Old South Ward, but also in the new housing estates. So urban planning became part of a larger government framework that increasingly understood its role through the lens of surveillance, counterinsurgency, and containment. So information about the relationships between the police, Home Affairs, the Department of the Environment, and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive are still kind of in the process of becoming declassified, but we can see from a 1971 Home Affairs document on public attitudes toward security operations that they called for a closer relationship between civil, military, and planning at the level between broad policies on the one hand and the conduct of tactical operations on the other. So security concerns became increasingly relevant. Within the urban core, the landscape underwent some major shifts. Houses that had once lined the hillside that led down from the city walls into the heart of the area were torn down and they weren't replaced. So this is essentially the photograph of the same place from the same perspective. Instead of building new homes, the Redevelopment Authority left the land vacant. It left clear views of the streets below, the houses and the flats in the Bogside from the walls where the soldiers had an army patrol. The decreased density that I talked about earlier made areas more visible for surveillance, limited possibilities for blockades and barricades that were so much a part of the early protests, and increased the speed and ease with which military vehicles and security personnel entering the area, simultaneously restricting the possibility for residents to leave covertly. Right, so if those of you were here yesterday, there was sort of motion of people walking out the back. You'd go out the back garden and out the back alley, and you could move through the neighborhood without necessarily being super visible. All of that changed through the process of redevelopment. Other land changes also discouraged unrest. The original plan for Rossville Street called for 3 multi-story flats, rather than the one single high-rise that was built in '66 and demolished in 1989, thank God. Instead of building high flats or erecting popular maisonettes, a 4-lane roadway was developed through the heart of the area, running north-south. Barricades that had been so central to the no-go zones could no longer be erected. In an area where most people didn't have cars, there's now a 4-lane roadway that was nearly 25 meters wide. So, this is a photograph of the Dark Lane. The Dark Lane pops up in a lot of poems in The Town I Loved So Well, the song Phil Coulter made famous and made Derry famous by, was replaced with a flyover. And some of you might know Kevin Hassan. He's one of the Bogside artists who's responsible for the Bogside murals that people are really familiar with. He actually drew this image for the community mirror. And if you look at it, it's kind of a memorial, as well as a statement, right? There's one of the old 2 up, 2 down houses that we saw John Hume looking at with the flyover running right through it. Free Derry Wall and Free Derry Corner. Looks a little bit strangled there and somewhat more like a gravestone than a center of community life. Sean Quinn and Barney Ferris had a chemist shop on the Lecky Road, and it was demolished in order to put the flyover through. And Sean Quinn said, you know, it broke up a lovely wee community. And Barney Ferris said, that flyover broke my heart. There's just an image of Rossville Street. Hold on 1 second. Of course, I got my pages out of order, so give me just 1 second. Okay. When the Troubles continued, the Department of the Environment and Department of Social Services continued to seize these sites of community gathering and protest as opportunities for redesign and redevelopment. A large piece of land on Rossville Street across from Glenfata Park, where many of the protests and much of the violence associated with Bloody Sunday took place, was allocated for the use of a community center. You know, those of you who know Derry know that's where Pilots Row opened its doors in 1980. And if you walk inside Pilots Row, you'll actually see all of the street names of all of the streets and alleys that were destroyed because of the redevelopment. Vacant land between William Street and Abbey Street, close to the intersection with Rossville Street, was utilized to build the William Street Residential Care Center for older people. When architect Peter Maloney was interviewed about planning and militarization of space in Derry, he suggested that these decisions were made to curb violence by investing the space with alternative community value, right? There's no surprise they put senior housing and a community center in areas where there had been so much public protest. It stood to reason that people would be very upset if riotous behavior occurred where elderly people were living, where children were playing. Contested spaces were converted for uses that deterred protest and encouraged decorum. At the same time, innovations in the layout of the estates and architectural and planning shaped the way people moved through them. The proliferation of really short streets, the use of cul-de-sacs were one of the most significant designs of the redevelopment in the area. These designs foster micro-communities, yes. They orient houses towards the cul-de-sac. But in Derry, they also made it clear, made it easy for streets to be blocked by police or military vehicles. The erection of concrete bollards between housing units ensured that there is only one way in and there is only one way out of most streets. So this legibility of the landscape with few trees, no alleyways, uniform design, bright streetlights, made it really difficult for people to move through the space without being noticed. Urban renewal in Derry was not unique, right? It resembled that of the UK, of the United States, of Western Europe. The landscape became increasingly legible everywhere. The proliferation of green space, the creation of these small residential communities, the accommodation of car culture, the creation of these big wide roadways and these flyovers, these bypasses. But in Derry, planning also supported security tactics aimed at containing civil unrest. It replaced a locally legible landscape with a universally legible one. I also want to say that at this time, neighborliness, the idea of community, became newly stressful. It began before Bloody Sunday with internment. It was exacerbated after it, and it was continued by redevelopment. People were moving. Extended families were not always placed near one another. The breakup of big family networks coincided with other changes to personal community life in Derry. Residents moving to the new housing estates left their churches, they left their schools, they left their community centers. Many of the foundations of everyday life were shaken up, surrounded by people they didn't necessarily know or didn't know well. In an era of political and social turmoil, a lot of people found themselves without strong community ties. So these are just some examples of the ways in which the conflict and the ways in which surveillance and the ways in which the Republican movement sort of started to shape how people interacted with each other. The first one is an example of kind of saying, please watch your kids because they might tell a police officer that their daddy's involved and then that dad is going to disappear, right? He's going to be interned. And there's a very similar sort of statement from the IRA's Green Book. One of the things that I have found really interesting about this move to the outside of the city is that you might live next to your sister in an adjacent housing estate, but the buses came in and out of the city center. So there weren't a whole lot of telephones. There weren't a whole lot of ways to communicate with each other. And so to go to see someone in a nearby housing estate, you'd go into the center of the city and you'd take another bus back out, right? And checkpoints became kind of a ubiquitous part of life at that point. But it also made getting together, being together, much less convenient and much less kind of a fact of ordinary life. So it's not just me saying this. A 1974 report says that the population is moving around and they're, for the most part, strangers to each other. They're frequently looking back home to one of their old Derry neighborhoods. So in oral histories, in radio programs, throughout the late 1970s through the mid-80s, Derry people drew on their memories of bulldozed neighborhoods and the lives that those neighborhoods had sustained in order to give voice to what had been lost, both through the redevelopment, but also through the troubles, through the conflict. Memory must always be understood as taking place in service of the human right to exist, in both the individual and in the collective sense. So it follows here that remembrance about life before urban redevelopment, before civil rights, before Bloody Sunday, can be seen as deeply purposeful, I think, within the context of the conflict, within the conflicts of changes to the cityscape, and within the conflicts of internal community schisms. Memory work could obliquely kind of get at some of the worries and anxieties, even as it reminded local people of their commitments to one another, helping to fill the cleavages in Catholic Derry by underscoring the importance of a shared history and articulating over and over and over again the value of community and shared identity. During the height of the conflict and amidst dramatic dislocations, Derry Catholics, they spent their time doing memory work, talking about really ordinary stuff. Really ordinary stuff. And when you listen to these, you're going to think they sound nostalgic. Some of you might be familiar with the scholar Svetlana Boym, who died really way too young. But she's one of the most important people for helping us think through nostalgia, about a way to connect not just to a different time, but also to a different place. So one woman interviewed anonymously summarized kind of this argument in 1984. Where I was born and where I lived was Wellington Street, a small street in the heart of the Bogside. That particular street was a community unto itself. It had its people, it had its shops. You never had to go to the city center. You could do everything you wanted to, including bury your dead, because we had an undertaker there. Most of Derry was made up of streets like that, communities within communities. When redevelopment took place, the city was split up, and people from the streets were moved into housing estates outside the center. The move, it was fair enough. They acquired houses, but that's about all they acquired. Remembrance work depicted a physical community characterized by great liveliness in the streets and on street corners, intense poverty, a sense of dignity, and a sense of duty to one another, and above all, a kind of a shared life that was the direct result of a shared fate. In these stories, the coordinates of belonging were understood to have been imposed to a great extent by the realities of poverty and the impossibilities of physical and social mobility. There is an ambivalence, a deep ambivalence. There is no great yearning for the old days, and yet still there is a really deep sense of loss. Bishop Daly, in his memoir about the Troubles, wrote that the new homes were welcome and long overdue. At the same time, he acknowledged this loss. The bonds developed over many generations, which had cemented these communities together, were beginning to loosen and disappear. The new communities just never acquired the solidarity or cohesion of the communities that they replaced. Tommy Harrican looked back on repercussions of urban renewal in a 1986 interview. He refuted the idea that the core vitality of relationships between Derry people had been decimated, but he did acknowledge that this physical disintegration had its impact, right? He said, well, the redevelopment certainly didn't destroy community spirit, but it broke up an existing community. James Coyle Ray made the same point about ambivalence. He said, well, we had a very close-knit community, and I'd like to see it again, but I would not want to pay the price that was paid for that community spirit, because it made the people close. They were one. They were one in their poverty. And Frankie Ramsey, Swanky Frankie, comments about whether or not the old days were better. He was adamant that poverty and lack of opportunity not be romanticized, that Derry before civil rights, massive urban redevelopment, expanded educational opportunities, and a strong safety net not be cast as some golden age. At the same time, though, there were intangible benefits to the older way of life. They were the good old days, he said, in terms of community awareness, community togetherness. But as far as material concerns, with things like money and various things that are flying about today, no, they weren't the good old times. They definitely were not. But they were the good old times, because the spirit was lifted. The humor was there. There was an awful lot to look back on, as I do now. Most of the people who were interviewed in this process during the 80s were actually very clear that they felt lucky to have been born when they were. And that makes a lot of sense. Just everything that, this weekend is about makes that kind of very clear. The present, with its material advances, was welcome. Old Derry, however, had shaped them. To live in the Catholic neighborhoods of Old Derry in the half century before urban renewal meant that one belonged to a community that functioned according to a clear, even rigid, set of codes. Designated for survival, those codes established a shared identity and nurtured it. Story after story affirmed that people felt indebted to its values, sensibilities, and even the constraints that it imposed. It had yielded a vibrant, embracing community that prized neighborliness, social responsibility, the ability to make do, and the ability to make do with a sense of humor and a sense of grace. Amidst the violence, the mistrust, new schisms, both class schisms and sort of schisms between folks who wanted to follow a constitutional approach and those who advocated physical force republicanism, I think memory work recalled those qualities as a means of invoking them. Not simply an expression of nostalgia for a way of life that didn't exist, or, like, okay, boomer, whatever, I'm sure it was great when you were younger. But these images and narratives articulated also a sense of what could be hoped for: trust, mutual regard, responsibility, and a sense of belonging. So people took the opportunity of these oral histories to reflect on the physical spaces that had nurtured and quite literally grounded community life. Mrs. Rooney, for example, wanted to remind people that cul-de-sacs and open spaces in the housing estates were really a rupture. She said, I think about how the houses would be huddled together. There were streets. She insisted that she had great neighbors in her housing estate, but she just hearkened back to Nelson Street. She said it was long, and you'd go up and down it, and the neighbors were at the door, and they always had a chat to you when you were passing up and down. That's gone. No more of that. Alex Hassan remembered the residents on the street where he was raised treated one another with a kind of openness that had disappeared. There was no knocking on doors of other people's houses. You just walked in. If there was trouble, all the neighbors would gather around. Frankie Ramsey suggested that the physical spaces of the community had yielded particular kinds of interactions when he said the whole life revolved around the corner. The street corner featured in so many remembrances. While halls were popular in the winter months, these little kind of corrugated tin huts, information was passed and people entertained each other on the streets when the weather was good at the corners. Mrs. Rooney also wanted to talk about interdependence. She remembered with clarity how neighbors provided backup and support in families' most vulnerable moments, in the middle of the night or when someone took suddenly sick. 2, 3, 4 in the morning, you always had a neighbor, a good friend. If anybody took sick, you had nothing to do, just knock up your next door neighbor, and we were in, you know? But now you'd hardly see that. I think those houses now, they're just too far apart from one another, you know? These physical spaces facilitated convergences. They fostered intimacies. Shared space, even cramped space, whether or not it was chosen or welcome, brought people into constant contact with one another. In addition, this political local geography was such that these micro communities of the Old South Ward sometimes consisted like the fullness of people's experience, right? They could learn, they could get their news, they could be entertained. It was their world. It was a small world, but it was a lively one. Father Daly looked back on his early days when he arrived in Derry, and he recalled the frenetic activity that seemed so at odds with all of these projections of it as a site of massive unemployment, replete with social pathologies, even claustrophobic and static. When he arrived, he said he found the place was alive. There were all kinds of men constantly doing the rounds of the streets. Coal men, gas men, Brock men, insurance men, bread men, debt men, cruelty men, lemonade men, corporation men, school attendance men, Indian and Pakistani men selling clothes, and then there was me. At this scale of social networking, even one family could loom large in the imaginative geography of the neighborhood. Alex Hassan compared the Kerrigan family from the Brandywell to a shopping center, where one-stop shopping might meet everyone's needs, legal and illegal. The Kerrigans might not have been paragons of virtue, but they provided entertainment and some hard-to-find necessities that made them memorable to their neighbors. And this is the quote: "There was a family of characters called the Kerrigan family. And if I were trying to compare them to the present day, now we have the Richmond Center. Well, the Kerrigan brothers, they were the Richmond Center of the Brandywell. Well, you know, you consider a dance hall, a rag store, a billiards hall, a greengrocer's, an estate agent, and a gambling casino. They were all part and parcel of the Kerrigan family." Community was physical, it was tangible, but it was also a process. When 2 community centers were built during this period, one pensioner recalled these tiny wee huts. And he said if they just took those millions that they're spending on the 2 big halls and built a lot of wee huts around the town in places where people gather to talk, wouldn't we have a grand winter? And you'd take an interest in your own hut. I did. I know it, for I did it. How many years ago? 50 years ago. Terry Doherty remembered Shamrock Hall on Joseph Street as the site of great community participation. He too wanted to underscore the point that one brought one's talents and one's abilities to the broader community, and in so doing, brought that community into being. As I said before, poverty was a common foe. If poverty was understood to be related to political and social marginalization in Northern Ireland for nationalists, this was largely understood and not necessary to be spoken. The battle was conceived in part as one against despair, isolation, and fear that often accompanies persistent financial insecurity. As a result, it was understood that community members offered up to the fight everything in their arsenal, implicitly understanding that while individual offerings might not be enough, pooled resources might be stretched sufficiently. In a lot of these memories, I think about financial insecurity and sharing and generosity. There is also a little bit of an oblique reference to the era when all Catholics, middle class, working class, professionals tended to live relatively close to each other, right? And that did change for a lot of different reasons. We had people that washed the beds, people that wrote the letters, people that gave advice. The thing about it is, they didn't set themselves up in offices. They weren't appointed to these jobs. It was where people cared, and they had a particular talent, and they were known for it. And they made themselves available to other people who were maybe less articulate, maybe less fortunate. Money, entertainment, these things were scarce. People had a common foe to face, and that's how they faced it. The one sort of like last example that I'll give you is that people paid attention to each other, and they also paid attention to who was paying attention to people. So if you were on transitional benefits, if there was something in your house, a piano, say, or like, God forbid, a TV, this would be, just a very clear violation, a clear indication that you really didn't need financial benefits, right? So at Christmas time, neighbors would kind of want to help families in financial distress. If you knew a man on transitional benefits and he had a large family and things were tight and there was kind of a surreptitious whip round, and some of us would drop in on the night of Christmas Eve and we'd say, well, Jimmy, that'll buy something for the Wans, and maybe just give him 10 bob. It would make his Christmas. The final kind of piece of this that I want to share is this sense about Derry characters, right? They came up over and over and over again. If shared struggles had kind of created cultural coherence in Old Derry, it also led to an understanding of different kinds of difference. And so residents really wanted it remembered that Derry had once been peopled with characters, pavement artists, loose women, alcoholics, and unfortunates. Many remember Chimney Ornament, who went around selling ornaments door to door. He never lived indoors. He lay out every night, and the story was that he made his tea in a small tin over a penny candle, and that was his heat and his light. There was Barney Nealis, who, at least in memory, would stand on the same street corner from 8 a.m. until midnight. Mary Marley remembered that Nealis was so dirty that frequently during the day, he would extract a cloth, and it was kind of like a flypaper. It would gather vermin from his body, and then he would kill them, sort of meticulously. But she said they were part of Derry. Everyone knew them, and they were part of our city. James Coyle Ray lamented the loss of these characters, remarking that Derry had only produced one proper character since the 40s, and that was Tipperary. Of course, there was Johnny Cuttums, and we're going to hear John Hume talk about him for me to end up. But James Ray contrasts this universal legibility with this local legibility. He says, I miss the color. There were so many colorful people. Now, I went across Foyle Street a couple of days ago, and all I saw was car parks, but there's no cars in them. They've tumbled all the buildings. There's nothing left, only clean spaces and empty car parks. They say it's progress, but I just can't see it being that. So here's a 1985 Gay Byrne late show with an all-Derry audience. Whoops.
Talk to me about Derry characters, John. Are there any characters in Derry now?
Well, I think when we were all growing up, we were all very conscious that there was plenty of characters around the city. And but I don't think there's any around today at all, because, and I think one of the reasons for that is that they've all passed the 11 plus. Because I believe our characters were highly intelligent people who didn't get a formal education, and their intelligence didn't find an outlet, so they became eccentric, and we thought we were laughing at them, but in fact they were laughing at us. And I think that one of the reasons we don't have characters today is for that very reason. But we had a lot of them in the old days.
And did you have anything remotely resembling like a Bang Bang in Dublin, or any of those guys? You furrow your brow when I mention Bang Bang, but any Dubliner worth the salt will know who Bang Bang was.
Yeah.
But did you have any of those guys around?
Well, I think we had a lot of them, and I'm sure that every neighbourhood in Derry, when we were growing up, there was a very great neighbourhood consciousness. You were conscious of what area you came from. And we had plenty of characters. In fact, one of them, who's probably our best known character, I'll just call him Johnny, and everybody will know who I'm talking about.
Johnny.
Bishop Daly went to visit him. He was very old at the time and was in our local psychiatric hospital. And Bishop Daly went down to visit him. And Johnny was talking to him and says to him, "How you doing, Father Daly?" And Bishop Daly, of course, used to be Father Daly. That's the way they get on. And Johnny says to him, he says, "But I'm now Bishop Daly." Johnny says, "I saw you last." He says, "Well, don't worry about it, Father." He says, "If you stick around here for another fortnight, you'll think you're the Pope."
You have to see this last bit. This is John Hume throwing shade at Nell McCafferty on national TV.
And everybody thought Johnny was mad.
That's right. Johnny was, who's laughing at who? Yeah.
He's still around now.
Oh, he's still around.
He's still there, is he? Yeah. And who else then? Are there any others that you can think of?
Yeah, well, there was Maggie, whom we all knew when we were growing up.
Maggie.
And the great story about Maggie, of course, is again in the cathedral saying her prayers, and as she always did at the top of her voice, and she's interrupted by a lady who prayed there regularly. Says, "Excuse me, madam, but you're too loud and you're distracting me. Would you mind lowering your voice?" So Maggie looked around at the altar, looked up and down at the lady and said, "As I was saying, Our Lady of Lourdes." Before that, so-and-so interrupted me. And the word was not so-and-so. It's a bit too impolite to use here, but...
Isn't that lovely?
But that was another very well-known... And as I say, I think most people here could talk about the characters in Derry, but they have all gone. And I think one of the reasons for it is the fact that... just you imagine Nell McCafferty, for example. If Nell hadn't passed the 11 plus and got a university education, what sort of character...
Watch your face. Watch your face. She's like...
It did be calling her Nell.
Sorry about that. And she was still in Derry.
Come to think of it, you just say Nell. Everybody knows who you're talking about anyway. There you are.
So, after Bloody Sunday, the Bogside became symbolically representative of a cohesive, coherent Catholic culture that in some ways didn't exist. A space that stood in for all these lost spaces, the presence of which spoke to the absence of so much. In the wake of the destruction of physical spaces of Catholic Derry, everyone became a Bogsider.
All right, so I see that everyone has got their coffee. We're all caffeined up.